Hello, my name is Dr. Bathi Kasturiarachi. I'm a faculty member at Kent State University at Stark. And today we are going to discuss a concept called the universal design learning. And with me, I have a colleague of mine from Perry High School. So I will ask her to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Ashley Meinke, and I teach at Perry High School, AP Calculus, Honors Pre-Calculus, and Algebra 2.
Okay, so as we mentioned before, this is going to be a discussion on universal design learning. And for short, we will be calling it UDL. And there are certain components to it. And as we go through this presentation, you will get to know the different angles from which we are coming at UDL. So universal design learning is a framework to guide the design of learning environments that promote access. And UDL supports learners to excel and become expert learners who will then become motivated, resourceful, and knowledgeable. It also helps all learners to cultivate a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. And UDL aims to change the design of the learning environment rather than change the learner. So it is important that we focus on the learning environments and see if we can intentionally design to reduce barriers that we know impede access and then try to promote equity and inclusiveness in the process. So instead of my describing what UDL is, I want to take you to a video where they talk about UDL at a glance. And so let's watch this video from the website CAST, where transforming education through UDL is being described.
This teacher needs to meet a curriculum goal, and she's got a very diverse group of students. And so does this teacher. And this one. Most do. In fact, research shows that the way people learn is as unique as their fingerprints. What does this mean for teachers of today? Classrooms are highly diverse, and curriculum needs to be designed from the start to meet this diversity. Universal design for learning is an approach to curriculum that minimizes barriers and maximizes learning for all students. Whoa, that's a fancy term. Universal design for learning. Let's unpack it a bit. Let's think about the word universal. By universal, we mean curriculum that can be used and understood by everyone. Each learner in a classroom brings her own background, strengths, needs, and interests. Curriculum should provide genuine learning opportunities for each and every student. Now let's think about the word learning. Learning is not one thing. Neuroscience tells us that our brains have three broad networks. One for recognition, the what of learning, one for skills and strategies, the how of learning, and one for caring and prioritizing, the why of learning. Students need to gain knowledge, skills, and enthusiasm for learning, and a curriculum needs to help them do all three. But every learner is unique, and one size does not fit all. So how do we make a curriculum that challenges and engages diverse learners? This is where the word design comes in. A universally designed building is planned to be flexible and to accommodate all kinds of users, with and without disabilities. It turns out that if you design for those in the margins, your building works better for everyone. Curb cuts and ramps are used by people in wheelchairs, people with strollers, and people on bikes. Captioning on TV serves people who are deaf, people learning English, people in gyms, and spouses who get to sleep at different times. UDL takes this idea and applies it to the design of flexible curriculum. UDL goes beyond access because we need to build in support and challenge. So how do we use the UDL framework to make learning goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone? First, ask yourself, what is my goal? What do I want my students to know, do, and care about? Then ask, what barriers in the classroom might interfere with my diverse students reaching these goals? To eliminate the barriers, use the 3 UDL principles to create flexible paths to learning so that each student can progress. Number 1, provide multiple means of representation. Present content and information in multiple media and provide varied supports. Use graphics and animation, highlight the critical features, activate background knowledge, and support vocabulary so that students can acquire the knowledge being taught. Number 2, provide multiple means of action and expression. Give students plenty of options for expressing what they know and provide models, feedback, and supports for their different levels of proficiency. Number 3, provide multiple means of engagement. What fires up one student won't fire up another. Give students choices to fuel their interests and autonomy. Help them risk mistakes and learn from them. If they love learning, they will persist through challenges. And remember, always keep in mind the learning goal. Get rid of barriers caused by the curriculum and keep the challenge where it belongs. And that's it. Okay, quick recap. Show the information in different ways, allow your students to approach learning tasks and demonstrate what they know in different ways, and offer options that engage students and keep their interest. Universal design for learning equals learning opportunities for all. For more information on UDL, go to www.cast.org.
Now that you have had an overview of what universal design learning is, let's try to unpack the 3 ideas, the 3 pillars of UDL in a different order. We are going to start with engagement. We feel that the why of learning is important enough that we should focus on that first. So engagement means you are going to provide multiple means of engagement, as was described in the video. And this is the why of learning. And neuroscience tells us that certain parts of the brain will be receptive to the why of learning. So to dig a little bit deeper, what you need to be aware of with engagement under UDL is to know that learners differ in the ways by which they can be engaged or motivated to learn. Some learners are highly engaged, as you know, and they are very spontaneous and do novel things, while others remain disengaged. Some learners might want to work alone, while others prefer to work with their peers. So this is where you have to find a balance between individual work and cooperative learning in the classroom. So there is not one way of doing things. There is not one means of engagement that can be optimal for all learners. So as an instructor, as a teacher, you need to be aware that certain things work best with certain concepts. And so the takeaway is providing multiple options for engagement is essential.
So an example of engagement is the blended learning model that I have adopted this school year at Perry High School. And this model promotes the idea of student choice. The components of the blended learning model are the class calendar, which include bell work, video lessons, guided notes, online homework through various platforms such as My Math Lab or Delta Math, and self-paced review. So we're going to dig deeper into this model by first clicking on the class calendar. This is an example from my AP Calculus class. And what's really nice about this model is that it can meet the needs of learners both virtually or in a traditional setting. It also is appropriate for students who might be absent. So everything is linked here. For example, looking at this week of December 7th, we have the bell work linked. They can click on a video lesson. And the idea is that they can watch that in class, or they could watch it the night before the lesson itself. So this has really made my lessons much more efficient. It has taken an hour lecture and cut it down to often 30 minutes or 20 minutes. Here you can see that the blank notes are also linked, so they can click on that. If they're absent, they can print this out at home if needed. The video lesson appeals to the students who will need the auditory feedback, whereas the notes that are worked out, that can appeal to some students who might just be better at reading through mathematics. Of course, I encourage the students to watch the video lectures. So everything is laid out here. I post this in the Google Classroom and they have access to it. And they always know what to expect each day. It also advocates for students to work at their own pace, ask questions when they need to, pause the video when they need to ask me questions, and to also rewatch the video. I've had students comment that they like to go back and rewatch the video multiple times when they're studying. Another example of the idea of choice and self-pace is a self-paced review through a Google Slides. So students will take a small whiteboard and work in pairs or in groups, or they can even work by themselves. So again, modeling both individual and cooperative learning. So students would work through, here's an example of a problem, and then on the following slide is the answer with some explanation. So problem, answer, etc. And the homework is through online platforms for honors pre-calculus and AP calculus. We use My Math Lab. For Algebra 2, I use Delta Math. And I will dig deeper into some more of these items as we move along. At the beginning of the year, I put out a syllabus that described this blended model, and it described the role of the teacher. So I've taken on a much more facilitator role. I create, of course, the daily lessons and materials. I adjust the lessons according to the students' feedback. I remain in constant communication with the students and parents through email and in person. And the goal is to cultivate an environment of confident and independent learners. Then the role of the student is to be prepared for class and ready to learn each day, stay on task and complete all assignments in full, be an active learner, participate and ask questions, practice good study habits outside of class, and persevere through struggle when doing mathematics.
Those were some very concrete examples of how engagement can be incorporated into the classroom, and Ashley has done a nice job of getting that point across and being effective in what she does. So let's move on to the second idea that was mentioned in the video, which is the representation. In other words, providing multiple means of representation is important. And again, cognitive neuroscience tells us that a different part of the brain is going to be asking how the what of learning is going to happen. So when we come to representation, We know that different learners will understand concepts in vastly different ways. So learners differ in ways they perceive and comprehend. And for example, for some learners, high engagement and spontaneity and novelty, while others can remain disengaged. Learning and transfer of learning occurs in every classroom, and when multiple representations are used, the teacher can have a better understanding of how the students are engaging and try to prevent the disengagement. Multiple ways of representation also allow students to make connections within and between concepts. So, for example, if you take the concept of a function, which we think of as a fundamental object in mathematics, you can represent the function, as you know, in multiple ways. You can do a verbal interpretation of a function, and then you can do a pairwise interpretation of a function that will bring out the one-to-one correspondence nature of a function. Then you can have a visual representation by providing a graph, and then you can also finally represent it using an equation, which is the most common way of doing it. But different learners can pick up on different aspects of the function if you have multiple representations. So allowing students to make these connections will help them to understand the concepts better. And the final takeaway then is providing multiple options for representation is essential.
So extending that idea to the blended teaching model, students are given the opportunity to learn content through a variety of mediums due to the video lessons. So they can watch the lesson and listen. They can look at the completed notes. And of course, they also have access to me in person to supplement to the video lessons and the completed notes. So they're able to see the lessons in a variety of ways. And looking at a mathematical example through a limit problem. So we have a limit here. And in mathematics, of course, we can look at this graphically, numerically, and algebraically using multiple representations. So for example, looking at this graphically, we know this has a hole at x equals 1. And if you're virtual teaching or not even, you could have a link to Desmos to show this graphically. So you can see here, we have that hole at 1, 2, but the limit is still, of course, equal to 2. Another way to represent that would be numerically through a table, or algebraically through direct substitution, subbing that in to equal to. So that's a nice example where multiple representations can be used.
So finally, we come to the third idea that was mentioned under universal design learning. And this is the action and expression idea. And how do we provide multiple means of action and expression? And this goes to the heart of learning, where the how of learning is being tested. And again, a different part of the brain is active when you talk about the how of learning. So let's take a deeper look at this. We know that learners differ in ways they navigate a learning environment. Some may be able to express well in a written form, in written text, but not in speech, and vice versa. So when it comes to assessments, we as instructors and teachers have to be cognizant of this, because if we test students in only one single way, then we may not be able to find a balance and give them a platform with which to express themselves in a different way and still arrive at the same answer. So action and expression require a great deal of strategy, practice, and organization. And so this takes in a lot of experience as a teacher. And also, when you encounter a new situation, you need to be able to adapt pretty quickly and try to find ways to engage the student so that they are able to express how they arrive at answers. And we will talk a little bit more in detail little bit later on a couple of techniques that can be used, and Ashley will get into some of them as well. But providing options for action and expression is again essential.
So a couple of ideas that I've used in the classroom this year have provided students with opportunities for reflection and metacognition through check-ins, test corrections, and a reflection and goals assignment. So let me show you examples of those. So these are some non-traditional ways to include writing in mathematics, especially during a virtual teaching that we've all been experiencing. So a homework check-in would look as follows. So this is a simple Google form. Students fill out their name and how they feel about the lesson and any questions they might have. So we can see some examples of student responses here for this particular lesson. Notice that most of the students were understanding it pretty well. A few were in the middle. And then if you go down, you can see all the questions in one little area here. You can see some weaknesses like completing the square and things like that. So as a teacher, you can quickly look at this and say, okay, these are the areas that I need to hit on. And this works really well if you're teaching remotely or in the traditional classroom. Another idea for a check-in is a before test check-in or before any assessment. So a similar idea. And this is a great way to hold the students accountable for their own learning and make them take ownership of it. So they do a checklist. I watched the videos, I took notes, I completed all the assignments, I completed the review assignments, I asked questions when I didn't understand. And then they have to reflect on skills that they're doing well and skills that they need to work on. So looking at some student responses here, it creates a nice visual here with the data, so you can look at that. And then you can see students were listing their strengths and weaknesses for this particular lesson. Another idea is test corrections, and this I used in AP Calculus primarily this year after students completed their practice AP exams. So the template looks like that. They list the question, their answer, why their answer is incorrect, and the correct answer, including explanation and work. So here's an example of a student's test correction template. So you can see they do a nice job of differentiating, between an actual mathematical mistake versus just a silly error that can be easily corrected. So it gives them a nice way to reflect and think about their mistakes and make corrections. And pairing with that is the reflection and goals assignment. So after they completed their test corrections, they had to then break down their strengths and weaknesses and then 3 goals for themselves before the AP exam. And I have a few examples of student work listing their strengths and weaknesses. Notice the students were very specific, and I appreciated that. And goals, work on their weaknesses, be able to successfully do the free response questions, etc. So they took 2 of these practice exams and they were able to reflect on both of them. And then this one's my favorite. As you know, in calculus, there's a lot of algebra mistakes to be made, unfortunately. And of course, those unpopular derivatives. So I love these succinct goals of this student. Don't overthink it. Algebra, 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 and study the definitions.
Those are very nice examples of concrete ways in which we can look at how students can improve on what they're doing. And in particular, Ashley, I like the fact that the test corrections can be done on a template. I've never used it. This is something that I will pick up on because that gives them some structure to work with. This past year has been pretty difficult for a lot of our students, whether they are in high school or whether they are in middle school, whether they are in a university setting. It has been difficult because everything has been in a virtual space. So as we consider how we share knowledge and support young learners in both in-person and virtual spaces, I think it is critical for us to consider ways on how we use technology to ensure access and equity. So along with universal design, there are three presences that would be nice to touch upon. Um, Unknowingly, you have been exposed to two of these today so far in the presentation. One is the teaching presence and the other is the cognitive presence. So we will not touch upon the social presence too much because that aspect depends on whether you're in high school or whether you're in college. The social presence can mean different things. But we have done some exposure to teaching presence and cognitive presence. And if we dig a little bit deeper and look at the intersection of these things, which will come in a little bit, you will see that these three principles are connected in such an intimate way that we need to be aware of all three presences. One of the interesting facts that I came across was that of the 50 odd million K through 12 students, there's about 15 to 16 million who, at this particular juncture in time, after a year of COVID and remote learning, they lack devices or lack internet access. And of that 15 to 16 million, 9 million don't have access to devices nor to the internet. So you can imagine how the inequity in learning plays into this whole remote learning system. And so just being aware that we need to make some changes and work towards higher goals is an important thing. So let's take a look at what equity pedagogy essentially means. We are not going to dig too deep into this, but equity pedagogy essentially means finding teaching strategies and classroom environments that help students from diverse racial, ethnic, cultural groups to attain knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed to function effectively within and create and perpetuate a just and humane and democratic society. And this is taken from James Banks' theory into practice. Um, in a nutshell, what it says is that the teaching strategies we use, the teaching presence, and the classroom environment that we create can play a huge role in effectively creating knowledge units within the class that can then grow into something bigger. If we put the three presences that I mentioned, the social presence, the cognitive presence, and the teaching presence in a Venn diagram, this is how it looks like. Your total educational experience happens when all three presences are working together. But independently, these presences have their own little focal points. For example, goals and directions can go into teaching presence and cognitive presence. Engagement with participants that we've discussed in this presentation before goes into the social presence. And then supporting the discourse and the sharing of information can be in the intersection of social presence and the cognitive presence. The regulated learning, some of the examples that Ashley was showing, can be in the intersection of teaching presence and the cognitive presence because you are aware of what the needs are. And then setting a climate in the classroom that is inclusive is in the intersection of social presence and teaching presence. So just being aware of these presences and learning a little bit more about them would go a long way to arrive at that optimal educational experience for our students. So moving from there, recently I have been doing some research on why mathematics is considered to be a difficult subject. And lately there's been some research on how we can rehumanize mathematics. And two of the key things that you'll need in this journey would be access and achievement. Just because students have access to education doesn't mean that they can succeed. You have to focus on the achievement portion as well. If access and achievement happen together, then teaching mathematics can become a very dynamic enterprise. So understanding what dehumanizes mathematics is important. And then providing students with windows and mirrors to a relatable world is even more important. I have depicted four different things in here on the right side. One of them is where mathematics appears in nature, and you can easily tie the growth in nature to mathematics. You can look at jazz. Mathematics gets used quite a bit in jazz music. Then you have this art form from the Indian culture. They're called just mandalas, where you draw with chalk symmetric pictures that have very intricate mathematical properties. And the same is true with the native Indian culture, where mathematical symmetry appears quite a bit. So bringing these examples into the classroom can result in one or two students who were disengaged previously to all of a sudden get engaged, because it is giving a window into a world that they can relate. Going into a more concrete example, now this is coming from a little bit of higher mathematics in number theory, but I managed to tie this into trigonometry as well. Think about a bunch of numbers. I call them n numbers, A1, A2 through AN. You can think of 2 or 3 numbers, but let's think about an abstract n set of numbers. And you're asking the question, when will the sum of these numbers be equal to the product of these numbers? Now, typically students don't think about these kinds of problems, mathematical problems, because it just doesn't occur to them. So I call them the huddle numbers, because it's kind of like a huddle in a football game, where the product is considered the huddle. And when the game begins, all of a sudden, people are dispersed, the players are dispersed, and you have a sum. So you're asking, when is the huddle going to be effectively doing the same thing as the sum? And for example, when n is 2, for two numbers, a1 plus a2 equals a1 times a2, there's a simple solution. Take the numbers 2 and 2. 2 plus 2 is equal to 2 times 2. If you have 3 numbers, you can take the numbers 1, 2, and 3. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6, and 1 times 2 times 3 is 6. And so I take this idea and then try to extend it to non-integers and ask whether this question can be answered. And it turns out that when we are doing trigonometry, one of the tangent identities will satisfy the huddle equation for n equals 3. So these are interesting ideas that are deep enough that not one aspect of it is an answer. You have multiple aspects of the answer, and you can bring that together in one presentation, which we will get to in one of the videos that's coming up as a technique. So to summarize equity pedagogy a little bit, there are different things you can do in your classroom that can effectively create an environment where the students can feel that there's equitable learning going on. For example, think, pair, share is a good technique that you may have used. Small groups, we all use small groups. Open-ended questions. This is like the Huddle equation. You give an open-ended question for which there is no clear answer, and it gets students thinking, and you can give them some time to think about this. And if you feel that a class is a little bit disengaged, you can do some cold calling, and you have to be a bit careful how you do it, but cold calling is another technique. And in the middle, you have the culturally relevant examples. This is to engage everyone who comes into your class, especially in a college setting. We have very diverse populations, and you want to make sure that everyone who comes from music or nursing or from a different ethnicity has an example that they can relate to culturally. And then there's this technique called wait time, which we are going to look at a little bit more in depth, and the idea of multiple voices. And so let's take a look at wait time. Wait time is processing mathematical concepts requires time to think. We know that. Silent thinking can be very uncomfortable for students and professors alike, right? You ask a question and there's dead silence, and then you begin to think, oh, did I get through to them? What's going on? But unknown to us, some students could be thinking. So what is an appropriate wait time is a question that we should be asking. So providing extended wait time can increase the number of students who volunteer to participate and improve the quality of their responses. So let's take a look at this short video. This is coming from a college setting, but I think it is relevant.
Sometimes silence is important. How long do I wait before I decide to move on, or before I push further with additional prompts, versus just waiting it out? When we're sitting in large groups and she asks the question and no one raises their hand, V's never going to make someone give a response. But I wanted to just open it up briefly to hear any lingering questions, ideas, thoughts, concerns, and feelings that remain after viewing one or both of these documentaries. In this case, I chose to wait it out based on, I think, the weight that I felt in the room. There was a weight, a tension, and a curiosity that I sensed. Obviously, I was a little concerned as to why they were being so quiet. They had a lot to say, and I could see it. I could see it in so many of their facial expressions. I could read it in their body language. Things like they're looking to each other, they're looking to me. I look for engagement. So if it stays as quiet or as slow that long, and I see that students look checked out, I will move on. But in this case, they were engaged. So many of them were just struggling with how to enter the conversation. So that was what I was waiting for. When I'm deciding kind of when and how to respond to questions posed by the students during class, I'm really listening for really the content, right, of their question, and I'm noting whether or not the question is one that I feel confident or excited about hearing what the students have to say in terms of their response, especially when it's, well, why do you think? Anytime a question starts that way, Why do you think, or why is it that when it's so open to interpretation and additional kind of questions and analysis, I'm willing to wait.
I just don't understand why is just teaching another version of history so like radical? What is the fear around that? Like, I just think it should be something so normal and commonplace, and I don't know why it's so political. So anyway, yeah. So I was thinking about Precious Knowledge that we watched yesterday.
Even when it gets uncomfortable, because I think it's just as important for the student to hear as well as each other, more than just my opinion. At that point, I'm really trying to draw out of them. There's sometimes it happens quickly, and other times it takes a little more wait time. Then there are other times where students pose questions that are pretty content specific, right, or historical questions, and if it's something that I feel I have the expertise to be able to respond, I wait to see if somebody else might also, but that's when I will wait less.
How do you, I don't know what happened after the fact because the film ended. So like, how do you empower them to like also still be engaged in ethnic studies, even though they're being told from like the lawmakers, from the superintendent or whoever, that ethnic studies isn't valuable and it's un-American. So I guess that was my question, was like, what do you do with the students after that happens?
Okay, so a couple of questions about there. One, I want to quickly address this one.
The facilitator is there to guide the discussion and not really impose his or her own views. But what I also like about her facilitation method is that she's also able to switch out of the role as the facilitator and into the role as, of the instructor. The facilitator role is to be strictly neutral. They're usually there to just pose the questions and to kind of make sure the norms of respect are there and clear, which V does. But then switching into the instructor role, she helps you make sure you're understanding the concepts correctly. She does a good job of making sure that we're not just having these very unfounded discussions on these different concepts that we have, but that we understand what the actual concept is and what we're talking about.
So that was a quick excursion into how wait time becomes important in discussions. And in mathematics, this comes into play when you give an open-ended question. How much wait time do you give? How much cooperative learning could they do? How much individual work could they do before you can solicit some reasonable responses? The second technique that I want to focus on is the use of pre-work. And this is to ensure that we honor diverse voices and at the same time structure the discussion. So multiple voices is what we are trying to achieve here. And you do that by using pre-work. Now, I know many of you as instructors, you may have encountered wrong answers. And I don't know whether you can enumerate the many ways you react to wrong answers. Sometimes students who feel shut down by a professor after taking an intellectual risk may think twice before they raise their hand the next time. I've seen this happen many times. Instructors sensitive to this possibility nurture curiosity by acknowledging the difficulty of the concept and then invite the students to journey towards a better understanding. So how do we do that? The technique involves using pre-work. And how do you use pre-work? You give a problem that is fairly complex and has multiple approaches to a group of students. An example from mathematics would be if you take a look at solving a quadratic equation. Ashley mentioned in one of her presentations that students had difficulty completing the square. Now, completing the square, interestingly enough, is a very ancient method of literally geometrically completing the square in order to get this algebraic completion. So you can bring in history. You can solve quadratic equations using a square root method, for example. You can use a quadratic equation and solve it by factoring. You can, of course, use the famous quadratic formula. So there's multiple approaches. And then what happens when you have complex roots? How do you depict those complex roots? Because your parabola obviously does not intersect the x-axis. So how do we depict the complex solutions that we get on a two-dimensional plane? All these have different thinking that goes in. And if you can create a problem or at least a concept around solving quadratic equations, you can then assign students to different tasks. That's the pre-work. And then it takes a little bit of effort on the part of the instructor to put everything together. And then you tell the student, okay, you are going to take over slide number 3, and you will explain how to complete the square for that given problem. And that way the students will take ownership of what they're learning, and it gives them agency. And I think that is very important. And so pre-work will help to bring these diverse voices into the discussion. So let's take a look at a video that explains this in the context of a wider educational background.
So Jane, in order to give equal weight to different voices in the class, that's something that I've never seen a professor do, which I think is fantastic. We have to write a reading response to her, an email, 300-400 words, once a week or so.
She will give you back your reading response, and she would say, among all the points that you wrote, X, Y, and Z are the most interesting. So I would ask you to articulate this argument in the slide 27.
Do you want to just describe that?
Yes, so you have, I was just applying what the second principle is. So I was doing these 3 worlds where you have the person A, the person B, and the person C.
And I tell people, look, I'm circling this, and I want you to more or less use these words because you have been very concise in when you're writing it. You've been very concise in bringing your words together, and I want you to be concise. I don't want you to waste the time of the class. I want you to not wander on about this.
It's a very useful tool for structuring at different important points what we should talk about as a group. It's also very useful, I think, for bringing in people who usually would not speak.
She's giving you time to prepare and to articulate your comment or your answer in a way that is going to provide the class something that is well prepared and well thought. In a class where 60 or 70% of the students don't have English as first language, it is super useful to know what you have to say and when you have to say in order to articulate and to be sure to communicate in the best way you can the idea to be efficient to the class discussion.
Is the way she gives voice to everyone, share a voice, the way she takes everyone's comments and makes something out of them or puts them in the right perspective, actually sort of erodes your biases a bit. I felt that way. I mean, I felt that I was paying more attention to everyone, not just to the ones that I would naturally listen to.
There's always a personal kindergarten pride that comes with seeing your name next to a particular idea and being acknowledged to make your contribution. That is fabulous because it's validating.
And we all know that when we produce something, we take ownership of it and we care about it more and we invest ourselves in it more. And so even when you're just producing words in a class, they're your words. They're not Jenny Mansbridge's words. They're your words. You've thought about them. You then, in a way, almost remember the whole class around your ideas. And so it's very important that there be some of your ideas in the class, and that's part of what discussion does.
So I hope this was helpful for you to think about ways of fostering ownership among your students by using pre-work.
And just to add to that, I think it's a great idea. And in the high school setting, I like to frame it as the students are experts at certain problems. So they get assigned a problem. And this is a great way to differentiate. If you have varying levels of students in one class, you can, give a really challenging example to a certain group and maybe scaffold it back for other groups. And they do really take ownership of it, and having them come to the board to explain their problem and having them be an expert is really neat to see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ashley. And I have a little story to share before you go to the next slide. I was not planning to share this, but in this remote setting, I have a phenomenal artist in my class. And her first instinct is to come and doodle on the whiteboard as I'm teaching, if she's invited to. So one day I was doing this word problem where we had to, it was kind of related to physics. There was this gal who was running away from a tree a certain distance and then stops and turns around and stops before she comes back to the tree at a water fountain and drinks some water and then stays there for a period of time. And so you had to sketch the graph of time and distance from the tree. And so as I was explaining the mathematical aspect of the graph, I invited her to draw the picture of what was happening. And so she did a beautiful picture of a girl running from a tree first, and then someone running from the tree and a nice water fountain. And all this was happening at the same time that I was explaining. And I couldn't think of any other way this could be done in a face-to-face setting. So I was very happy, and I took a screenshot of that one. So again, she took ownership of part of the problem that I hadn't expected.
Right, and really utilizing her strengths as an artist too. That's a cool
Exactly.
story.
Yeah. So again, this has been a difficult year. So we want to end on a positive note about self-care. Initially, I think we all thought virtual teaching will be less physically demanding than teaching in the classroom, but it did bring unique challenges on its own. For example, eye strain, back pain, and what's known as Zoom fatigue are very common. And also accessibility to you almost constantly, because they think that you can be either on Teams or Zoom all of the time and can be reached, and that could be an issue as well. And so teachers and students equally need to take self-care, and research clearly has shown that there is a strong link between exercising and improving energy and sleep habits and the mood you get into. All these things are interconnected. And so I exercise regularly by running, especially because now it's spring and the weather is nice. But Ashley has done some pretty unique things. So I want her to describe what she does with her students when it comes to self-care.
Thanks. So yoga can be used in both the virtual and traditional classroom setting in a variety of ways. In particular, we don't usually connect math and yoga, but it certainly can be connected. So I have added something into my classroom called math yoga. And it started out kind of as just a funny thing, but it's really taken ground and running now. So you can see my class there last year doing some functions. So y equals x. It's a really great way to describe functions in the classroom, even just when they're sitting in their desks. So I'll say, show me, x squared, show me negative x squared. And this could certainly be done in a Zoom session. You could encourage them to get up and stand, or just as they're, seated, doing the movements. And sometimes my students at this point will even request it, and we'll just take a 5-minute break and get up and do some yoga to get their bodies moving after sitting all day. I have been teaching traditionally all year, so this has been a little easier to incorporate. But again, using it for functions is a great way. Using it for end behavior of polynomials, where you have up, up, down, 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 up, down. You can use a lot of geometry to describe the yoga poses. And it's just a really great way to promote the mind-body connection. Yesterday, I actually took my calculus class outside, and we were able to enjoy the fresh air. And I was using the math terms as I described the yoga poses. And one of my students was like, this is hard to think about math and do the yoga poses, because we were doing some more intense poses than just the standing ones you see there. So it can be a lot of fun. And so I encourage you to check out my full presentation on math yoga that I gave through Texas Instruments. The link will be embedded into this presentation in the shared documents and slides that you will get. So please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact info is listed there.
Yeah, and that picture, I couldn't find a good picture of me on my own. I had some old ones, so I thought I'll share this one. So this is the famous actor Fonzie. He came as a featured speaker to Kent State, and this was a picture that was taken a couple of years ago. I thought it would be funny to have a picture with him. And my contact information is there as well. Sorry.
We thank you for your time. Please reach out and collaborate with us.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Ashley. And I hope all of you have a fantastic summer.